In this video on the Japanese style of bookbinding called Fukuro-toji or pouch binding, I'm going to show you how to sew the outer binding in the historical variant known as Kangxi. I have my book block with my covers attached and ready. I have designated which side is the back. I picked the side with the knots on the inner binding. For all of the variants, you start with the basic 4 holes from the basic 4-hole variant. So those holes are located 3/8 of an inch in from the spine. So I'm going to measure that and draw a line. Now generally I prefer to use a template that has the holes pre-punched. In this case I have one template that can be used for the basic 4-hole, the Kangxi style, which is this one, or the hemp style, which will be in a future video. All I have to do is line up the template and mark the holes I need to punch. If you're doing a lot of books the same size, that can be very helpful. But today I'm going to show you how to do it without a template. So we have our outer stitching line, just 3/8 of an inch in from the spine. Our outermost 2 holes are going to be 5/8 of an inch in from the top and bottom edges. I'm going to measure 5/8 of an inch and place a little mark on my line. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And then the other 2 holes are placed to be so that the 3 long stitches ideally would be even. For the particular size book that I'm making, that doesn't work very well. The measurements are not good measurements. So I tend to do 1 3/8 inches for the 2 outer stitches and 1.5 inches for the inner stitch. Those tend to be good measurements, and they're easy to measure on my ruler. So I'm going to measure 1 3/8 inch in from the 2 outer stitch marks. That was not 1 3/8 inch. Wrong part of my ruler. One 3/8 inches in from there. One 3/8 inches in from there. Unless you are a perfectionist, it's not imperative that these measurements be perfect, so if you'd prefer to simply eyeball the locations, that's fine. One thing I do try to avoid is getting the holes for the outer binding stitches too close to the stitches for the inner binding. I don't want to accidentally punch through the inner binding when I'm punching my holes. So now we have the 4 holes, the basic 4 holes that form all of these bindings. What makes the Kangxi binding different is these 2 outer holes that are halfway between the outer edge and the first hole, and halfway between the spine and the stitching line for the 4 holes. So in my case, that's going to be 5/16 of an inch and 3/16 of an inch. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to measure 3/16 of an inch in from this stitching line, and I'm going to make a mark roughly halfway between this first stitching hole and the top or bottom edge at 3/16. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Then I'm going to line up my ruler between those two marks, and I'm going to measure in 5/16 from the outer edge. And that's where I'm going to place the actual mark that I'm going to punch. So now I have all my holes marked. I'm going to take my awl and a rubber mallet and a backstop to protect my work surface, and I'm going to go punch the holes. Since it is loud, I'm going to pause it while I do that. Now when you're punching your holes, you want to make sure that you punch them so that the awl is perpendicular to your stack of books, not at weird angles. I also find it helpful when I'm done punching to insert my awl from the other side, just to make sure that the hole is appropriately wide all the way through, since I'm using a tapered awl. And you want to make sure that the holes are big enough so that your needle and thread can pass through them several times. If you don't make them big enough, you may end up having to fight your needle and or use pliers to get it through. So the next step is we're going to stitch them. You're going to need a needle with an eye large enough to hold your thread. And you're going to need your thread. I use cotton embroidery floss because it is easily available and comes in lots of colors, but a more traditional material would be silk. For this, you're going to need a length of floss approximately 5 times the height of the book. And I always leave a little extra for the knots. You can use a longer string if you prefer, but you don't want it to be too long because then it will make your life more difficult keeping the string from tangling. Thread your needle. And tie a knot in the opposite end. You want your knot to be large enough that it won't pull through the hole, but not so large that it's going to create a large bump where it is. So I find tying it twice works fine. Also, I'm using all 6 strands of embroidery floss. You can use less if you prefer, but I find that makes the stitching really pop against the book. So to start out, you're going to insert your needle through the spine of the book and come up through the second main hole from this edge. This is the same spot that we start all of these stitching techniques. It's a little tricky. I find it useful to go through the paper first and then the cover. It's a little bit easier that way. And you want to pull until your knot is buried in the pages, but not so far that it's going to block the hole when you stitch it. So the stitching pattern is very similar to the 4-hole, with just a little bit added variation for the 2 extra holes. So we start by wrapping the thread around the spine. So we go from the front to the back on the hole you started out in. See what I mean about tangling your thread? It's even worse when the thread's super long. And then you're going to go to the next hole in this direction. And then you're going to wrap the spine again. So you're going to go from the back to the front with the hole you're working through. And then you're going to keep going this direction. And you're going to wrap the spine. And then you're going to wrap this edge. And you can adjust your stitches, move them around a little bit as needed to have them perpendicular. And when you're doing these stitches, you want to make sure that they are good and tight, but not really, digging into your paper. If you need to retighten some of your stitches, you can kind of work back through, get them nice and tight. And this is where you have your first variation from a basic 4-hole stitch. You're going to go into the little hole in the corner. I call it little. It's the same size as all the others. And then you're going to wrap the spine. And then you're going to wrap this edge. And then you're going to go back into this hole on the main stitching line. And then you're going to continue as if it were a basic 4-hole binding. Back into this hole. And then this one. And then you continue on in this direction. One of my threads snagged, so I'm just going to smooth this out. You can, if you prefer to wax your thread before you start, do that. It will help keep the threads together better and may help reduce snarling. I personally am not a fan of waxed threads, so I don't do that. So we're going to wrap the spine. And then this edge. I will caution, if you're working with silk, it snags very easily. So make sure your work area is very clean and your hands are smooth, if possible. I'm going to go into this hole. Actually, I'm going to tighten up those couple of threads first. See, they're a little loose. I don't like that. I don't want loose threads. I'm going to loosen this last stitch that I did. And then I'm going to find the ones that were loose by gently tugging on each of the threads in turn until the one that was loose becomes tight again. There we go. Found it at last. And then these ones are now still loose, so I'm going to gently tug on my working threads until they tighten up. That was one of them. There's the other one. And I'm going to smooth out my thread. Okay. And then I'm going to go into the hole in the corner. I'm going to wrap the spine. I always wrap the spine edge first and then the other edge. It doesn't really matter. This is what I meant about punching the holes large enough. If you don't, they can be a little difficult to get the needle through. You can use something hard like your bone folder. Wiggle the needle a little bit, that usually gets it free. If nothing else works, you may have to resort to using pliers. I keep a set on hand because I run into this reasonably frequently. Just gently grip your needle with your pliers, drag it through the hole. And then continue stitching. You can prevent that by punching larger holes when you do the hole punching. The downside is you don't want excessively large holes because that can allow greater movement of the thread, which will wear it out faster. So, with time and experience, you may learn the appropriate size hole that you need. And each of the different binding styles is a little different because the number of times that you pass the thread through the hole determines what size hole you require. So, I have now finished all of the stitching. I'm going to tie a knot, same way you do for all of these. You're going to run your needle under these two threads to form a loop. You're going to pass your needle through the loop and pull it tight to form a small knot over the hole. If you want to be extra secure, you can do it again. And then you're going to pass your needle through that hole and out the spine of the book. Then you're going to cut your thread along the spine. You don't want your thread perpendicular to the spine when you do this, you want it out at an angle. And then you're going to take your needle and a little bit of glue, tiny bit of glue on my needle, and you're going to push the end of the thread down in between the pages. And you're just going to pinch it for a moment to let the glue set. Gluing the end of the thread into the pages of the spine will help prevent the thread from unraveling. Also, it will help prevent the thread from peeking out the side of the book. So it's partially for aesthetic reasons. At this point, you can take your clips off. Your book is now held together with its covers by the outer binding. The last step is to finish gluing your cover to your end sheets. To do that, you take a little bit of your glue. I use rice starch paste glue, but you can use PVA or pretty much any glue that dries flexible. apply a line of glue to the folded over edge of your cover. And make sure you don't have any large lumps. And then you're just going to press your book closed. Hold it for a moment to let the glue set. Flip the book over and do the same thing to the other cover. You will then take a piece of parchment paper and place it between the end sheets and the rest of the book to protect them in case any glue seeps out around the edges of the end sheet, and place the book in the press overnight or until the glue dries. Once it's dry, your Kangxi book will be done.